They dismissed him as nothing more than a parade prop, just a royal guard in coveralls, cleaning up shell casings while the real professionals got the job done. That was, until an SAS sniper chuckled, handed him a custom .338 rifle, and dared him to hit a target no one had managed to touch all week, 2,395 meters out. When he pulled the trigger, the entire range went silent. But before we show you how it all played out, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, because this is one story you won't forget. Dawn broke over the Scottish Highlands like spilled ink bleeding across parchment, the darkness reluctantly giving way to a grey morning that promised little warmth. The Lark Hills Long-Range Complex sat nestled in a valley 40 miles north of Edinburgh, where ancient stone walls met modern precision shooting ranges, and tradition collided with cutting-edge military technology. At precisely 0530 hours, Lance Corporal Marcus Flint stood motionless beside the range's equipment building, his scarlet dress uniform a brilliant splash of color against the muted landscape. His white-gloved hands moved with mechanical precision as he maintained his ceremonial bayonet, each stroke of the polishing cloth executed with the same attention to detail that characterized every aspect of his appearance. The towering burskin had sat perfectly centered on his head, and his posture remained rigid despite the dampness seeping through the morning air. To any casual observer, he appeared exactly as intended, a living piece of British military pageantry, a human monument to tradition and ceremony, the kind of soldier whose primary function was to stand perfectly still, while tourists snapped photographs and children pointed in wide-eyed wonder. A palace decoration in human form, maintained at considerable expense for reasons that had more to do with heritage than practical military necessity. 30 meters away, Corporal Josh Mallory of the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment saw something entirely different. Mallory had been watching the ceremonial guard for nearly 15 minutes, and every detail of the man's bearing triggered his professional instincts in ways he couldn't quite articulate. There was something about the way Flint held himself, not the rigid formality of parade ground training, but the controlled stillness of someone accustomed to remaining motionless for hours, while death hung in the balance. "Would you look at this toy soldier?" Mallory muttered to his shooting partner, Sergeant Dave Hendricks, as he arranged his equipment on the firing bench. "Probably thinks that letter opener he's shining actually qualifies as a weapon." The SAS team had occupied the Lark Hills facility for the better part of a week, conducting advanced marksmanship training in preparation for their next operational deployment to the Horn of Africa. It was the kind of specialized skill maintenance that separated elite forces from conventional military units, the ability to engage targets at distances that pushed the absolute boundaries of small arms capability. Their current challenge involved a steel target positioned 2,950 meters downrange, nearly 2 miles across the valley floor. For 6 days, the best snipers in British Special Forces had been humbled by that distant piece of steel. The Highland geography created wind patterns that shifted without warning, thermal currents that bent bullet trajectories in unpredictable ways, and atmospheric conditions that changed moment by moment. Despite their considerable skills and state-of-the-art equipment, none of them had managed to achieve a single hit at that extreme range. Mallory was arguably the most capable marksman among them, with a verified combat record that included confirmed eliminations at distances exceeding 2,800 meters. His custom .338 Lapua Magnum rifle represented the pinnacle of precision shooting technology, equipped with a Schmidt and Bender scope that cost more than most soldiers earned in 6 months. The ammunition he'd hand-loaded specifically for this exercise was crafted to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, yet the distant target had remained untouched, mocking their efforts with its pristine surface. Flint continued his methodical maintenance routine, apparently oblivious to the military precision being demonstrated around him. His movements never varied, the same number of strokes with the polishing cloth, the same interval between inspections, the same subtle adjustments to his uniform's alignment. But there was something hypnotic about the consistency, a rhythm that spoke of discipline refined through countless repetitions. "Right then," Mallory announced, his voice carrying across the morning stillness with calculated volume. "Time to show Palace Boy what real soldiers accomplish when they're not playing dress up for tourists." The mathematics of extreme range shooting were as unforgiving as they were complex. At 2,950 meters, a .338 Lapua Magnum bullet would drop nearly 400 feet from its initial trajectory, taking approximately 4.2 seconds to reach the target. During that flight time, A 10-mile-per-hour crosswind could deflect the projectile by more than 8 feet. Temperature variations along the bullet's path could alter its velocity, enough to cause misses measured in yards rather than inches. Mallory understood these variables intimately, having spent the better part of a decade mastering the science of long-range precision. His shooting position was a study in technical perfection, bipod legs adjusted to the millimeter, stock position precisely in his shoulder pocket, cheek weld consistent to the point of mechanical repetition. Through his high-powered scope, the distant target appeared as a small rectangle wavering in the morning thermals, barely larger than a postage stamp to the naked eye. Wind southeast at 11 knots, Hendricks reported, consulting his portable weather station with the focused attention of an artillery spotter. Barometric pressure 29.92 and falling. Temperature at muzzle position reads 41 degrees, estimated 44 at target elevation. These weren't merely numbers, they were the critical variables that would determine whether 250 grains of precisely machined projectile would find its mark. Across nearly 2 miles of Scottish Highland, Mallory's ballistic computer processed the data with electronic precision, generating firing solutions that accounted for everything from the Earth's rotation to the specific ammunition batch being employed. His first shot felt perfect from the moment he pressed the trigger. The rifle's recoil was absorbed by his body's positioning, the muzzle barely shifting as the bullet began its long arc across the valley. Through his scope, he tracked the vapor trail until atmospheric conditions made it invisible, then waited for the telltale sound of impact that would confirm success. For seconds later, a small puff of dirt erupted 2 feet to the left of the target. Bloody thermals, he cursed under his breath, working the bolt mechanism to chamber another round. The second attempt landed 18 inches closer to the mark, and the third actually struck the target's steel frame with a satisfying metallic ring that echoed across the landscape. Close, but not close enough. Not for a regiment sniper, and certainly not for someone whose reputation had been built on impossible shots, in impossible conditions. It was at that moment that Lance Corporal Flint did something that changed the entire dynamic of the morning. He moved, not dramatically, just a subtle shift in position that brought him several steps closer to the firing line. His polishing routine had ceased, and those pale blue eyes were now fixed on the distant target with an intensity that seemed completely at odds with his ceremonial role. For the first time since the SAS team had arrived at Lark Hills, he looked less like a tourist attraction and more like something altogether more dangerous. Challenging conditions for that particular shot, Flint observed quietly, his accent carrying the precise diction of proper military education overlaying something considerably rougher. Around the edges, Mallory looked up from his rifle, irritation flashing across his features like summer lightning. Oh, really? And what would a palace ornament know about challenging shots? The question hung in the morning air between them, carrying implications that neither man was quite ready to address directly. Flint's expression remained neutral, but something in his bearing had shifted, a straightening of the spine that made him seem somehow more substantial, more present. I know you're not compensating for the valley effect on your wind readings, Flint replied with the same quiet professionalism. The actual conditions at target are running northwest at approximately 7 knots, not southeast at 11. Your elevation data is calculated for sea level conditions, but that target sits 847 feet higher than your shooting position, and your scope's parallax adjustment is off by at least 2 clicks at that distance. The silence that followed Flint's technical assessment was the kind that settles over a room when someone has just revealed knowledge they weren't supposed to possess. Mallory stared at the Royal Guard with an expression that mixed disbelief with growing unease, while the other SAS operatives exchanged glances that suggested their assumptions about the ceremonial soldier were rapidly being revised. And exactly how, Mallory said with deliberate slowness. Would someone who spends his days posing for photographs know anything about parallax adjustments? Flint's smile was so subtle it barely qualified as a change in expression. Same way, I know that rifles been zeroed using Pakistani military ammunition, which runs approximately 40 feet per second slower than the match-grade rounds you're firing today. Same way I know that barrel has roughly 3,000 to 100 rounds through it, which means your group sizes have opened up by at least half a minute of angle since it was new. He paused, his gaze never wavering from Mallory's increasingly stunned face. Same way I know the instructor who taught you to shoot, Sergeant Major Patterson, at the Sennybridge training area, used to say that confidence without precision is just expensive noise making. The final detail struck Mallory like a physical blow. Patterson had indeed been his primary marksmanship instructor. And that particular phrase was something the veteran soldier had repeated during every training session. But Patterson had been killed by an improvised explosive device outside Kabul 18 months earlier. The only people who would know his specific teaching methods were former students who'd been through his courses. "Who the bloody hell are you?" Mallory whispered, his voice barely audible above the morning breeze. Instead of providing a direct answer, Flint walked to a small equipment bag that had been sitting unnoticed beside the range building. From it, he withdrew something that made every member of the SAS team freeze in recognition. It was a hard case, not the inexpensive civilian variety used by weekend shooters, but a military specification Pelican case covered with travel stickers from locations that most people couldn't find on a map and bearing the kind of honest wear that spoke of serious professional use. When Flint opened the case, the weapon inside drew a collective intake of breath from the watching soldiers. It was an L115A3 long-range rifle, the British military's premier precision instrument. But this particular example had been extensively modified for specialized use. The stock bore custom adjustments for length of pull and cheek height. The barrel showed the distinctive spiral fluting of a match-grade tube manufactured to tolerances, measured in 10,000ths of an inch. Most significantly, the Schmidt and Bender scope mounted above the action carried hand-engraved range markings that spoke of extensive field use under combat conditions. But it was the small brass nameplate affixed to the rifle stock that caused Mallory's blood to run cold. Engraved in regulation military lettering were the words, "Property of 22 SASM Flint, Service number 47,291. Sweet Mother of Christ," Hendricks breathed, recognition dawning in his voice. "You're the Flint." The name carried weight in British Special Forces circles, spoken in the same reverent tones reserved for legends and impossible achievements. Marcus Flint, the sniper, who had eliminated a Taliban commander through the man's own rifle scope at 2,180 meters during a dust storm in Helmand province. The ghost who had terminated an ISIS bomb maker in Mosul with a single shot that traveled 3,247 meters, a distance so extreme that atmospheric conditions along the bullet's flight path had to be calculated in segments rather than as a single trajectory. The phantom who had spent 4 years operating in locations that didn't appear on official maps, making shots that weren't recorded in official records, eliminating threats that weren't acknowledged in official reports. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared in the special operations community, he had vanished from active service, transferred to the household division and assigned to ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace. Now he stood before them in his scarlet tunic and towering bearskin hat, assembling his rifle with the fluid economy of movement that marked a true professional. Every action was purposeful and precise, from the way he seated the bolt to the careful adjustment of the scope's internal mechanisms. This wasn't the fumbling of an amateur or the hurried efficiency of someone trying to prove themselves. This was the quiet confidence of a craftsman who had performed this particular ritual so many times that it had become as natural as breathing. The transformation was remarkable to observe. One moment, Lance Corporal Flint had been a ceremonial figure, barely noticeable except as an anachronistic splash of color in a modern military environment. The next, he had become something entirely different, a predator in dress uniform, every movement calculated and economical. He eschewed the elaborate shooting preparations that characterized contemporary precision marksmanship, instead settling into a simple kneeling position that used his left elbow braced against his raised left knee as a shooting rest. It was a classical stance, the kind taught to riflemen in an earlier generation when portable shooting supports were considered luxuries rather than necessities. But in Flint's hands, the position looked as solid and stable as any mechanical rest system. "Distance to target?" he inquired quietly, his eye already aligned behind the scope's eyepiece. 2,950 meters, Hendricks responded automatically, his voice subdued by the growing realization of what they were witnessing. Flint's hands moved to the scope's adjustment turrets, making corrections with the practiced ease of someone who had performed these calculations countless times, under every conceivable condition. Unlike Mallory's careful consultation of ballistic charts and atmospheric data, Flint appeared to be working from an internal database built through years of practical application. 6 clicks of elevation adjustment, then 3 clicks right for windage compensation. And finally he settled behind the rifle with the absolute stillness of a hunting predator. Through his own spotting scope, Mallory observed Flint's breathing patterns settling into the rhythm that marked professional level marksmanship. 3 deep inhalations to saturate his bloodstream with oxygen, followed by a natural respiratory pause as the crosshairs steadied on the distant target. The trigger press would come during that pause, between heartbeats, when the human body achieved its maximum stability. The shot, when it came, was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. A sharp crack as the propellant ignited, a slight dust puff from the muzzle brake, and then the long wait as physics took over and the bullet began its journey across the Scottish Highlands. Unlike Mallory's previous attempts, there was no visible vapor trail. Flint's ammunition had been loaded to different specifications, designed to minimize the telltale signature that could compromise a sniper's concealment. 4.5 seconds later, the distinctive metallic ring of bullet meeting steel echoed across the valley with perfect clarity. "Target hit, dead center," Hendricks announced, his voice carrying a note of awe that he didn't bother to conceal. Flint worked the bolt mechanism smoothly, ejecting the spent case and chambering a fresh round. Again came the controlled breathing pattern, the natural pause, the precise trigger manipulation that seemed to occur without conscious thought. Again, the interminable wait followed by the distant confirmation of success. "Second shot, dead center," Hendricks reported, his professional composure beginning to crack. The third shot came 40 seconds later, executed with the same mechanical precision as its predecessors. When the sound of impact reached the firing line, Mallory found himself staring at a man who had just accomplished something that he and his highly trained team had been failing to achieve for nearly a week. 3 consecutive hits at a distance that pushed the absolute boundaries of what was possible with small arms, executed with an ease that made the feat appear routine rather than extraordinary. What impressed Mallory most wasn't merely the accuracy, though that was certainly remarkable enough. It was the complete absence of drama surrounding the achievement. No celebration, no acknowledgement of the watching crowd, no triumphant gestures or verbal commentary. Flint simply engaged the rifle's safety mechanism and began the methodical process of field stripping his weapon for maintenance, as if he had just completed a routine training exercise rather than demonstrating marksmanship that bordered on the supernatural. "How?" Mallory finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Flint glanced up from his rifle case, those pale blue eyes meeting Mallory's with an expression that might have contained the faintest trace of amusement. "Experience," he replied simply. "Quite a bit of experience." The single word hung in the morning air with deliberate understatement, as if the ability to place 3 consecutive projectiles into a target, barely visible to the naked eye, was merely a matter of accumulated practice rather than a rare combination of natural talent, extensive training, and combat experience that few individuals would ever possess. Mallory found himself studying Flint with completely different eyes, searching for the professional indicators he had somehow missed during their previous encounters. They were present once you knew what to look for, subtle but unmistakable signs that spoke of specialized training and operational experience. The way his gaze constantly swept the horizon in systematic patterns, never focusing on any single point for more than a few seconds. The unconscious habit of positioning himself with clear sightlines to all approaches and at least 2 potential escape routes. The economy of movement that characterized his every action, never wasting energy or motion on anything that didn't serve a specific purpose. "The Almanzor elimination," Sergeant Hendricks said suddenly, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. "Mosul, 2019. That was your handiwork, wasn't it?" For the first time since he had begun speaking, Flint hesitated. The pause was barely perceptible, perhaps to seconds of silence, but it spoke volumes about the psychological weight that particular memory carried for him. "Mosul was a collaborative effort," he said finally, his tone carefully neutral. "I simply happened to be the individual holding the rifle when the shot was required." But Hendricks wasn't prepared to let the matter rest there. The Almanzor operation had achieved legendary status within British Special Forces circles, discussed in the hushed tones usually reserved for impossible achievements or supernatural events. An ISIS bomb maker responsible for at least 30 coalition casualties, tracked to a specific building in Mosul's industrial sector. The tactical problem was that the structure was surrounded by civilian dwellings, and Almanzor never remained in any single location for more than brief intervals. The shot, when it had finally been taken, originated from a partially destroyed apartment building 3,247 meters away over 2 miles of urban terrain. The projectile had required nearly 5 seconds of flight time, during which the target could have moved, sought cover behind concealment, or simply stepped away from the window where surveillance had located him. It represented a microscopic window of opportunity in both temporal and spatial terms. The official after-action report had listed the outcome as target neutralized by coalition forces. No names were mentioned, no specific methodologies detailed, no acknowledgement of the extraordinary skill required to execute such a shot under those particular conditions. But the special operations community maintained its own informal communication networks, and word of the impossible shot had circulated rapidly among those with appropriate security clearances. 3.2 for 7 kilometers, Mallory said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and disbelief. Urban environment, civilian structures creating unpredictable wind patterns and thermal effects. Midday execution when heat shimmer would have made accurate range estimation nearly impossible. Flint's hands continued their methodical cleaning routine, but something in his posture suggested that the conversation was entering territory he preferred to avoid. The conditions presented certain challenges, he acknowledged with characteristic understatement. Challenges. Mallory's laugh contained no humor whatsoever. Mate, I've been practicing precision marksmanship for 14 years, and I wouldn't have attempted that shot on a wager. The variables alone would have been enough to drive most shooters to distraction. How do you even begin to calculate bullet drop at that distance, the same way you calculate it at any distance? Flint replied with the same quiet professionalism. Physics remains constant regardless of the numbers involved. Muzzle velocity, ballistic coefficient, atmospheric density, target elevation differential, firing angle compensation. The mathematics don't change just because the scale increases. But even as he articulated the technical explanation, both men understood that the reality was considerably more complex. The fundamental equations of external ballistics were well established, but at extreme ranges the variables multiplied exponentially in their potential for error. A single degree of miscalculation in wind direction could result in a miss measured in meters rather than centimeters. An error of 50 meters in range estimation could send the bullet completely over or under the intended target. Temperature variations along the projectile's flight path could alter its trajectory in ways that no ballistic computer could perfectly predict. At 3,247 meters, Marcus Flint hadn't simply been engaging a target, he had been solving a mathematical probability equation that pushed the absolute boundaries of what was achievable. With current technology and human capability combined, the morning had evolved into something entirely different from what either Marcus Flint or Josh Mallory had anticipated when they first encountered each other across the firing line at Lark Hills. What had begun as a straightforward case of professional rivalry, the Special Forces operator's instinctive disdain for what he perceived as a decorative military anachronism, had transformed into something approaching professional reverence. Mallory found himself examining every aspect of Flint's equipment and methodology, searching for technical secrets that might explain the seemingly impossible accuracy he had just witnessed. The rifle itself, while obviously customized for precision work, wasn't dramatically different from what any professional marksman might employ. The optic system was high quality, but not exotic by modern standards. The ammunition appeared to be match grade, but not wildly specialized, beyond normal precision shooting requirements. Yet the subtle details told a more complete story to those who knew how to interpret them. The rifle's trigger mechanism had been adjusted to break at exactly 2 pounds of pressure, light enough to permit precise shot execution, heavy enough to prevent accidental discharge under stress conditions. The scope's reticle had been customized with additional reference marks for rapid range estimation under field conditions. Most revealing of all, the weapon stock bore the honest wear patterns that spoke of extensive use under harsh environmental conditions rather than careful maintenance in controlled settings. "How long were you with the regiment?" Mallory asked, employing the informal terminology that SAS personnel used when referring to their unit among themselves. "For years," Flint replied, his attention still focused on his maintenance routine. 2017 through 2021. "And then you simply departed to become a ceremonial guard?" The question carried an implicit accusation that Mallory made no attempt to disguise. Within the Special Forces community, departure from the regiment typically occurred through only a few mechanisms: medical discharge due to injury, disciplinary action resulting in dismissal, death in service, or retirement after decades of operational experience. Young soldiers in their physical prime didn't ordinarily request transfers to ceremonial duties unless something had gone seriously wrong either professionally or personally. Flint's hands paused momentarily in their cleaning routine, and for an instant his carefully controlled expression revealed something that might have been psychological pain. "Sometimes," he said quietly, his voice carrying undertones of hard-earned wisdom, "an individual grows weary of excelling at activities that ultimately serve no constructive purpose." The words struck Mallory with unexpected emotional force. He had been operating within the Special Forces environment long enough to understand exactly what Flint meant by that observation: the precision shooting, the impossible missions executed flawlessly, the targets eliminated from distances that transformed human beings into mathematical abstractions. It all began to feel clinical and disconnected after sufficient repetition. You could spend years perfecting the technical art of eliminating people you had never met, in service of political objectives you weren't permitted to question or fully understand, and eventually wake up wondering what meaningful purpose any of it had served. But this, Mallory gestured toward Flint's scarlet uniform tunic, standing motionless outside a palace, serving as a backdrop for tourist photographs. "This serves a constructive purpose. It represents honest work," Flint replied with quiet conviction. "I protect something genuinely worth protecting. I represent ideals genuinely worth representing. And at the conclusion of each day, I can examine my reflection in the mirror without wondering whose existence I may have made measurably worse." The explanation possessed a logical coherence that Mallory found somewhat uncomfortable to acknowledge. The Special Forces lifestyle was undeniably seductive: the elite brotherhood, the exclusive status, the knowledge that you were operating at the absolute pinnacle of human capability. But it was also psychologically corrosive over extended periods: the constant deployment cycles, the cumulative psychological toll of sanctioned violence, the gradual erosion of connections to anything resembling normal human existence. Mallory had observed capable men burn out completely, suffer psychological breakdowns, or simply disappear into chemical dependencies when the accumulated weight of their actions finally became too much to bear. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "The operational shooting, I mean." Flint's smile was barely perceptible, but it carried genuine warmth for the first time during their conversation. "Why do you think I continue maintaining my rifle in operational condition?" It was then that Mallory noticed something he had overlooked during his initial examination of Flint's equipment. The weapon case didn't merely contain the rifle and its associated accessories. Tucked into the case's foam interior were several items that spoke of continued professional activity: a current range membership card for the Lark Hills facility, credentials for 3 different civilian precision shooting organizations, and a small field notebook filled with handwritten ballistic data covering various ranges and environmental conditions. "You still compete," Mallory observed. It wasn't phrased as a question. "When duty schedules permit, and when certain individuals require gentle reminders that precision doesn't require special badges or distinctive headgear to be effective." The revelation added yet another layer of complexity to the puzzle that was Marcus Flint. Here stood a man who had voluntarily walked away from the most elite military unit in the world, yet continued practicing the specialized skills that had made him legendary within that community. It suggested someone who hadn't rejected his extraordinary capabilities so much as chosen to exercise them according to his own moral framework, rather than external military directives. "There's a competition scheduled for next month," Mallory said suddenly, the idea forming as he spoke. "King of 2 Miles event at the Bisley Ranges, international participation field. Some of the most capable precision shooters in the world, significant cash prizes, but more importantly, considerable professional recognition." Flint looked up from his rifle case, genuine interest flickering in those pale blue eyes for the first time. "I'm familiar with that particular competition. Maximum engagement distance of 3,500 meters, 10 shots for aggregate score, all weather conditions accepted. They've been conducting it for 3 years now, and no British shooter has ever achieved victory, because the most capable British shooter has been standing at attention outside Buckingham Palace wearing ceremonial headgear." Mallory replied with growing conviction. Perhaps it's time that situation was corrected. The suggestion hung between them like a formal challenge. Mallory wasn't entirely certain why he had made the proposal. The King of 2 Miles attracted serious international competition, drawing precision shooters from around the globe, military snipers, civilian champions, custom equipment manufacturers, seeking to demonstrate their latest innovations. It wasn't the sort of event where you brought someone simply to fill out the roster, but observing Flint's performance had been genuinely revelatory. The man didn't simply shoot with exceptional accuracy. He shot with the kind of unconscious competence that suggested his demonstrated capabilities were well within his comfort zone, executed without strain or maximum effort. 3 perfect shots at 2,950 meters wasn't luck or even remarkable skill. It was the kind of performance that indicated those particular shots represented routine execution, rather than extraordinary achievement. Entry fee is £500. Mallory continued, his enthusiasm building as he developed the concept, plus travel expenses, accommodation, ammunition costs, all the associated logistics. The regiment maintains a discretionary fund for competitive shooting activities, and I'm authorized to sponsor civilian entries when they're representing British military interests. And what exactly would I be representing? Flint asked. Excellence, Mallory said without hesitation, the kind that doesn't require advertisement or publicity to be effective. It was a calculated appeal to precisely the quality that had impressed him most about Flint's shooting demonstration. No theatrical elements, no self-promotional behavior, just quiet confidence combined with exceptional competence. In a competitive, shooting world increasingly dominated by social media personalities and equipment manufacturers seeking promotional opportunities, Flint represented something that was becoming increasingly rare: pure, unadulterated professional capability without ego or commercial motivation. I would require authorized leave time, Flint said, and Mallory knew he had succeeded in convincing him. Leave that administrative detail to me. I maintain contacts within the Household Division command structure. A single phone call regarding joint training exercises with Special Forces personnel, and you'll have all the time you require. They spent the following hour discussing practical details: ammunition specifications, transportation arrangements, equipment logistics, training schedules. It was the kind of conversation that revealed just how seriously both men approached precision shooting. Despite their different professional backgrounds, every variable mattered. Every detail could potentially determine the difference between success and failure at the extreme ranges they were contemplating. As the morning progressed, additional shooters arrived at Lark Hills for their scheduled range sessions. Word spread rapidly about the Royal Guard, who had achieved 3 consecutive hits at nearly 3,000 meters, and soon a small crowd had gathered around Flint's position. He answered their questions with the same quiet professionalism he had shown Mallory, neither dismissive nor boastful, simply sharing technical information with anyone who demonstrated genuine interest in learning. Observing him interact with the other shooters, Mallory began to understand something fundamental about why Flint had departed the regiment. It wasn't that he had lost his competitive edge or his exceptional capabilities. If anything, his skills appeared sharper than ever. Rather, he had discovered a way to exercise those capabilities without the moral ambiguity that accompanied military special operations. Here, on a civilian shooting range, precision became its own reward. No one died when he pressed the trigger. No political objectives were advanced or compromised. Just the pure science of ballistics and the personal satisfaction of technical perfection achieved. The return journey to London provided Mallory with time to process everything he had witnessed at Lark Hills. In the passenger seat of his Range Rover, Flint had reverted to his previous role as the consummate professional, offering minimal conversation and keeping his thoughts to himself. But the rifle case secured in the vehicle's cargo area served as a constant reminder that the man sitting beside him possessed capabilities far beyond what his ceremonial role might suggest. "May I ask you something?" Mallory said as they navigated the M40 through the Chiltern Hills. Flint nodded without diverting his attention from the passing landscape. "The palace assignment, was it voluntary? Or did someone in authority decide you needed a less demanding posting?" It was a delicate question, touching on the kind of personnel decisions that were rarely discussed openly within military circles. Elite soldiers didn't typically request transfers to ceremonial duties unless something had gone significantly wrong, either professionally or personally. "Elements of both," Flint replied after a considerable pause. "Command structure believed I might benefit from a change of operational pace. I thought they might be correct in that assessment. Difficult mission? They're all difficult missions, eventually. Some simply take longer to catch up with you psychologically." The cryptic response told Mallory everything and nothing simultaneously. He had been part of the Special Forces environment long enough to recognize the indicators of someone who had experienced too much, accomplished too much, carried too much psychological weight for too extended a period. The 1,000-yard stare, the emotional detachment, the way certain subjects were deflected rather than directly addressed. Flint displayed all the symptoms of someone who had reached the limits of his psychological endurance and possessed the wisdom to recognize that fact before complete breakdown occurred. Do you experience regret about leaving the regiment? This time the pause extended even longer, stretching until Mallory wondered whether Flint intended to respond at all. I regret many things, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated experience, but leaving isn't among them. They continued in comfortable silence for the next 30 kilometers, each man absorbed in his own thoughts and reflections. Mallory found himself mentally composing the phone calls he would need to make to arrange Flint's entry into the King of 2 Miles competition. It wouldn't present significant difficulties. His credentials within the Special Forces community would open the necessary doors, and the discretionary fund he had mentioned was legitimate. But he was beginning to understand that this represented something more significant than simply competitive shooting. Marcus Flint embodied something that was becoming increasingly rare in the modern military environment: pure competence without ego, lethal skill without bloodlust, professional excellence without the need for recognition or external validation. In a world where Special Forces operations were increasingly politicized and publicized, where elite soldiers became media celebrities and precision shooting became entertainment, Flint was an anachronism, a throwback to an earlier era when quiet professionals accomplished their missions without fanfare and melted back into society when their service was complete. The King of 2 Miles competition, Flint said suddenly, breaking the extended silence. What makes you confident I can achieve victory? Mallory considered the question seriously. He had observed the world's most capable precision shooters in action, had competed against military and civilian champions from dozens of different countries. Flint's demonstration at Lark Hills had been impressive, but the King of 2 Miles would operate at an entirely different level of difficulty. Longer ranges, more challenging environmental conditions, and competition from shooters who had spent years preparing specifically for that particular event. Because you don't shoot like someone who's attempting to win, he said finally. You shoot like someone who expects to hit whatever target you're engaging. And at that level of competition, expectation becomes everything. It was a subtle but crucial distinction. Most competitive shooters, regardless of their skill level, carried some element of doubt, the fear that this might be the shot that missed, the condition they hadn't properly calculated, the variable they had failed to account for. That doubt, however minimal, could introduce just enough psychological tension into the shooting process to transform a perfect shot into a near miss. But Flint had demonstrated something entirely different at Lark Hills, not arrogance or overconfidence, but calm certainty that suggested he had internalized the shooting process so completely that success was inevitable rather than hoped for. He hadn't appeared to be fighting his equipment or struggling with environmental conditions. He was simply executing a technical process he had perfected through thousands of repetitions, under every conceivable circumstance. The weeks preceding the King of 2 Miles competition passed with the measured rhythm of careful preparation. True to his promise, Mallory had arranged for Flint's authorized leave through official channels that asked no probing questions and required no detailed explanations. The cover story of joint training exercises between the Household Division and Special Forces was creative enough to satisfy military bureaucracy while remaining vague enough to avoid unwanted scrutiny. Flint utilized the time effectively, making multiple trips to long-range facilities throughout Britain to practice under varying environmental conditions. Unlike many competitive shooters who focused obsessively on equipment modifications and ammunition development, he concentrated on fundamental skills: breathing control, trigger manipulation, natural point of aim, and the mental discipline required to execute perfect shots under pressure. Mallory accompanied him for several of these preparation sessions, officially serving as a spotter, but increasingly functioning as a student. Observing Flint work was an education in precision shooting that no military training course had ever provided. The man's approach to the discipline combined scientific methodology with an almost intuitive understanding of how projectiles behaved in flight. Most shooters overcomplicate the process, Flint explained during one session at the Barry Budden Range in Scotland. They become so focused on calculations and data that they forget to trust their accumulated experience. Mathematics will get you close to the target, but instinct makes the hit. It was a philosophy that ran counter to most contemporary approaches to precision shooting, which emphasized technology and data analysis over traditional marksmanship fundamentals. But watching Flint consistently engage targets at distances where even minor calculation errors should have resulted in complete misses, Mallory began to comprehend what he meant. There was something almost mystical about the way Flint interpreted environmental conditions, the subtle variations in mirage patterns that indicated wind shifts, the way shadows fell across distant terrain that suggested temperature differentials, the barely perceptible atmospheric cues that told him when conditions were optimal for an extreme range engagement. It was knowledge that couldn't be programmed into ballistic computers or learned from technical manuals, the kind of wisdom that emerged only from thousands of hours spent behind a rifle scope. In every conceivable environment, the King of 2 Miles competition was conducted at a private facility in Wyoming, selected specifically for its extreme distances and challenging environmental conditions. The range extended across a high desert valley, with targets positioned at intervals from 1,500 to 3,500 meters. Competitors would fire 10 shots for aggregate score, with each target assigned different point values based on distance and difficulty. The participant field was formidable 67 shooters from 14 different nations, representing every discipline of precision shooting: military snipers from elite units, civilian champions who had dominated long-range competitions for decades, custom rifle manufacturers seeking to demonstrate their latest innovations, and wealthy enthusiasts who had invested fortunes in equipment that promised to deliver impossible accuracy. Flint distinguished himself primarily by how little he stood out among the other competitors. While others arrived with equipment trucks and teams of technical assistants, he transported his gear in a single rifle case and a modest backpack. His weapon, while clearly well-maintained, lacked the exotic modifications and custom features that characterized most of the rifles on the firing line. Even his shooting position differed from the elaborate rest systems and support equipment that most competitors considered essential. "First time at this level?" inquired the shooter positioned next to him, a bearded American who had introduced himself as a former Navy SEAL with 3 King of 2 Miles victories to his credit. "First time at this particular competition," Flint replied diplomatically. The American appeared skeptical. "Friend, no disrespect intended, but this isn't your local shooting club match. These distances will destroy you if you're not properly prepared. You might want to consider starting with something less challenging." Flint acknowledged the advice politely and continued his preparation routine. But Mallory, observing from the spectator area, noticed the way several other competitors were watching the quiet Englishman with curious attention. Word had circulated about the Royal Guard, who had supposedly outperformed in SAS team, and while most dismissed it as typical military exaggeration, a few of the more experienced shooters seemed to be taking the story seriously. The competition format was brutal in its simplicity: 10 targets at varying distances, each shooter firing in alphabetical order by surname. No second chances, no do-overs, no excuses accepted. The Wyoming wind was notorious for its unpredictability, capable of shifting direction and velocity without warning. The altitude, nearly 6,000 feet above sea level, meant that ballistic calculations developed at lower elevations would require significant modification. When Flint's turn arrived for the first target at 1,500 meters, he approached the firing line with the same unhurried composure he had displayed at Lark Hills. No elaborate setup routine, no last-minute equipment adjustments, no consultation with ballistic computers or weather monitoring stations. He simply settled into his shooting position, made to minor scope corrections, and waited for the range officer's command. The shot, when it came, sounded no different from any other rifle on the line, but the steel target's distinctive ring echoed across the valley with a clarity that spoke of perfect center impact. The electronic scoring system confirmed what everyone had heard: a perfect 10, dead center of the target. "Beginner's luck," muttered the American SEAL, but his voice carried less conviction than it had moments earlier. The second target was positioned at 2,100 meters, and the wind had intensified noticeably since the first round of shooting. Several competitors before Flint had struggled with the conditions, their shots going wide or falling short as they failed to properly compensate for the gusting crosswind. But when Flint's turn arrived, he seemed to have interpreted the conditions perfectly. Another center hit, another perfect score. By the fourth target, conversation among the spectators had diminished to expectant silence. Flint had yet to fire a shot that wasn't a perfect center hit, while competitors who had dominated similar events for years were struggling to remain on target at all. The distances were pushing the absolute limits of what was achievable with small arms and the conditions were as challenging as anyone could recall. The final target was positioned at 3,500 meters, a distance so extreme that the projectile would require nearly 5 seconds to reach its destination. At that range, even the Earth's rotation became a significant factor in shot placement calculations. The steel plate appeared impossibly small through the spotting scopes, wavering in the heat mirage like a distant mirage. Flint was the final shooter to attempt the ultimate target, having maintained his perfect score through 9 increasingly difficult engagements. The crowd had grown throughout the day as word spread about the unknown Englishman, who was systematically dismantling some of the world's most capable precision shooters. With apparent ease, camera crews from shooting publications were documenting his every move, and several ammunition manufacturers were already discussing potential sponsorship agreements with their marketing departments. But Flint appeared completely oblivious to the attention surrounding him. He prepared for the final shot with the same methodical composure he had demonstrated for the first, making small adjustments to his scope settings while interpreting wind patterns with eyes that seemed to perceive things invisible to everyone else. The wind had been gusting intermittently all day, but as Flint settled behind his rifle, it suddenly died to an eerie stillness. The entire valley seemed to hold its breath, as if nature itself was waiting to witness whether the quiet man in the borrowed shooting jacket could complete what was developing into one of the most dominant performances in precision shooting history. Through his spotting scope, Mallory observed Flint's breathing settle into the familiar pattern he had witnessed at Lark Hills. 3 deep inhalations, then the natural respiratory pause as the crosshairs found their mark. But at 3,500 meters, the target was barely visible even through high-powered optics. A tiny speck of steel that represented the absolute boundary of human marksmanship capability. The shot, when it finally came, seemed to suspend itself in the air for an eternity. 5 seconds of absolute silence as the bullet traveled its impossible arc across the Wyoming desert, carrying with it the hopes of a man who had walked away from everything to find peace and precision, and the dreams of those who had come to believe that perfection was still achievable in an imperfect world. When the distant ring of bullet meeting steel finally reached the firing line, it was followed by a moment of stunned silence before the crowd erupted in applause that echoed off the surrounding hills. The electronic scoring system confirmed what everyone already understood. Another perfect hit, completing a performance that would be discussed in precision shooting circles for generations to come. Flint worked the bolt to extract the final spent case, engaged his rifle's safety mechanism, and began the familiar process of disassembling his weapon. No celebration, no acknowledgement of the crowd's reaction, no triumphant gestures or verbal commentary. Just the quiet satisfaction of a task completed successfully by a man who had never doubted his ability to accomplish it. Later, as they drove toward the airport with the winner's trophy secured in the back seat, Mallory finally asked the question that had been troubling him throughout the day. How did you know about the wind conditions, the atmospheric effects, all of it? Some of those shots should have been mathematically impossible. Flint remained quiet for an extended period, watching the Wyoming landscape pass outside the window. When he finally responded, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned understanding. Because I stopped attempting to make impossible shots and started trusting that the achievable ones would be sufficient. It was, Mallory realized, the perfect encapsulation of everything he had learned about Marcus Flint, a man who had found peace not by abandoning his extraordinary capabilities, but by exercising them without the moral complexity that had once made them a psychological burden. On this day, in this place, precision had been its own reward, and that had been enough. As they flew back to London, the trophy secured in the aircraft's cargo compartment, Mallory understood that he had witnessed something rare, not merely exceptional marksmanship, but the transformation of lethal skill into something approaching pure art. Marcus Flint had demonstrated that excellence didn't require a uniform or a mission, or official recognition. Sometimes, it simply required a man, a rifle, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of achieving. The following morning, Flint would return to his post outside Buckingham Palace, standing at attention in his scarlet tunic while tourists captured photographs, and children pointed at his towering bearskin hat. But those who observed carefully might notice something different in his bearing, the subtle satisfaction of a man who had reminded the world, and perhaps more importantly himself, that true precision never announces itself, it simply delivers. When summoned, as quietly and efficiently as morning mist rising from Scottish highlands, The King of 2 Miles trophy would eventually find its place in a modest display case in the Household Division's mess hall, labeled simply Competition, Shooting, LSCPLM Flint. No mention of the distances involved, the conditions overcome, or the legends challenged and defeated. Just another piece of military memorabilia gathering dust while its owner returned to the honest work of protecting something worth protecting, representing something worth representing, and finding meaning in service that asked nothing more than excellence freely given. And if occasionally, on quiet mornings when mist hung heavy over the palace grounds, tourists might notice the way the silent guard's eyes swept the horizon, with the practiced gaze of someone who had learned to see impossible distances with perfect clarity, well, that was simply another small mystery in a city full of them, witnessed by those who knew how to observe, but understood by very few indeed.